Changing the valve cover gasket on my W124. This is a 1994 E320 with the M104 engine, the 3.2 liter version. I'll be changing the valve cover gasket on it. So here's the valve cover gasket kit, the factory one from Mercedes-Benz. Here is the part number for that. Additionally, you might also want to change the gaskets on the bolts. There are 10 of these. I'll put the part number on the screen. These are tools that I'll be using for this job today. So I have a 10mm nut driver, 7mm nut driver. I got a 3/8 inch ratchet, a 1/2 inch ratchet. I got an extension with an adapter. I have a 5mm Allen bit, and I have a 10mm socket. Also be really good to have some shop towels around. You can use this to wipe stuff down. So one thing you'll notice missing is a torque wrench. I do not recommend using a torque wrench on this job. I know this sounds kind of weird, but the torque on the valve cover is super low. It's 10 Newton meters, which is super easy to strip out. So that's why I opted to use the nut driver. If you just torque it down by hand, you'll feel it when it comes to a stop. That's pretty much where the torque is. Just don't go any tighter and you'll be fine. If you go Google the torque spec on the M104 valve cover, you see a lot of people complain that they stripped the bolts because they use a torque wrench. So just use a nut driver, just go feel it by hand and you'll be fine. To get started, let's put the hood in service position. So to do this, put the hood slightly down and release the tabs on the driver's side and the passenger side. And you can push the hood all the way up. And now we got plenty of room to work. We will need to remove the crossover tube from the top of the valve cover. So what we need to do is remove the mass airflow sensor. So there's a clip on the top and one on the bottom. And then we can undo the connector. This is actually the incorrect spot. It should be up top here, but same thing. It's just you twist it off, twist off the connector. Put that to the side. There are two 10mm nuts holding the crossover tube on top. So we just undo those. Next up, we have to loosen the hose clamp holding the crossover tube to the throttle body. So all we gotta do is undo that, which we'll have to go through underneath the intake manifold with a Phillips or flathead. We use an 8 or 7mm bolt. You can just undo it and it will loosen the crossover tube. So yeah, that is a 7mm bolt in case you're wondering. Once that's loosened up, we gotta undo the sensor right here. Hold the clip in and pull it out, come right out. And now this crossover tube can wiggle out and then we can remove this entire assembly. It'll be a good idea to cover the inlet for the intake right here. I just put a shop towel over it so that should keep debris from falling inside. To access this last rear bolt right here, we'll have to take this little cover off for the wiring harness. So just kind of push it inward, pull the tab down and release it slowly. Be careful not to break it. So there was some clearance issues because of this little insulation piece that sits back here. So all it is these twist off little nuts you could do by hand. I believe it's right here. It's like a 10mm or 8mm plastic nut. You could just also twist it off by hand. And this whole thing comes off. And now we got a lot more room to work back there. You should probably take this off before we remove the valve cover because it does flake off a couple pieces, which is why I covered it. With the crossover tube out of the way, we'll need to remove the cover for the spark plugs. So this is Allen. I believe it is a 5mm Allen. There are 6 of these bolts. We'll need to undo them. With all the bolts loosened, we can go grab the cover from the back and pull it up and use our other hand to kind of get out. All right, next up we'll have to remove the coils and the spark plug wires. So we'll start off actually removing this cover. These tabs are in these little latches, so you can use a flathead to kind of release them, and you can kind of slide it until it gets loose and we can move it out of the way like that. All right, next up we got to remove these spark plug wires and coils. So just pay attention to how they're routed. They're routed a specific way. The valve cover does have a little diagram on it, but in case anyone needs to reference it, just take a look right now as I'm going over it. Okay, so this is pretty simple. You just pull up on the boot. And then once you have all those released, you can remove coil, which also has the other boots. So there's 3 of those. Last one. And then you gotta just disconnect the connectors from the harness. So we can see that the middle one goes on top, the bottom one goes second, and then the back one goes last. All right, next up we gotta remove the harness out of the way. So we can just grab it, just held on by friction. And now that's out of the way. Now we need to loosen this bracket that holds all these cables on the side of the valve cover. So we'll just see there's a 10mm nut there and a 10mm bolt right here, and this should just pop right off. With the nut and bolt removed, we could just grab this entire harness holder right here and just kind of push it out of the way. For the wiring harness holder, the one closest towards the front of the car is the hardest to get out, but just wiggle it out and it'll come right out, and then we can push all this out of the way. Next up, let's take the front engine cover off. This is super simple. It's just clipped here and here. So all we gotta do is just pry it out. That's it. All right, now we are ready to loosen the bolts for the valve cover. There are actually 12 of them. They're 10 millimeter. So I would say break the bolts loose first, just one by one, going as evenly as possible. Try to go crisscross, try to release the pressure evenly so we don't bend the magnesium valve cover. So just be careful. This is magnesium valve cover, aluminum head, very soft metals. Proceed with caution here. Once you've broken all the bolts loose, we can actually just take them out the rest of the way and then remove the valve cover. All right, before you remove your valve cover, make sure everything is out of the way. So you see I taped the harness off to the side so it doesn't interfere. I'm gonna leave the bolts in. Right now they're all loose. I can actually take them out, but I'm leaving them in because some of them are different lengths. So when we take them out, we can note what position they're in so we don't get confused later. So now we can actually remove the valve cover. So if your valve cover has been on here a very long time, it's gonna be tough to get out. Do not pry it with any tools. Just try to wiggle it out by hand. Luckily mine was pretty easy to get out. Now I can remove the valve cover carefully. Also, before you remove your valve cover, make sure there's a nice and clean place to place it. So I'm gonna place it right here, brand new shop towels. All right, luckily they came out pretty easily for me. So hopefully yours comes out easy as well. And let's take a look. So I changed my head gasket in August of 2020. It is now June of 2024. That was the last time I also did the valve cover gasket. So we can see the head was cleaned up back then. Doing frequent oil changes will keep them looking clean. I got a new chain in here too in case anyone's wondering. Looks pretty clean. So before we place anything on the head itself, let's clean it up. So I'll grab a blue shop towel, wipe it down, make sure it's as clean as possible. This would also be a good time to replace these gaskets around the bolts. So you see they just come right off and they just slide right underneath the washer. Very simple to do. There's 12 of them. All right, just a recap on the bolts. The shorter ones are the ones in the middle. The longer ones are the ones on the side. So once you make a note of where all the bolts go and you replace your washers, we can move on to the actual valve cover gasket. With the valve cover flipped over, we'll see we have the gaskets for the spark plugs. There's 6 of them, and then the whole thing around the entire valve cover. So this will actually be pretty difficult to remove. It's been on a while, but it does come off. So actually mine still feels pretty soft. Not too bad for almost 4 years. When pushing these gaskets in, pay attention to these grooves that kind of help hold the gasket in place to the cover, and they should be sitting pretty flush once you get them situated all the way. So we'll see this one's a little up, we'll push it down, and the same thing with the actual thing on the side. Make sure it's seated all the way. The final piece is the little half moons in the back. They're really hard to see. I might even be able to pick up on camera, but if we stick our hand down there, sometimes we'll feel it. In fact, this one back here is missing, as well as this one. Wow, okay, both of them are missing. So that's probably why mine was leaking a little bit. We'll see that the new valve cover gasket set comes with 2 new ones. You just place them in the back. All right, once you have your head cleaned up and you have those half moons pushed in, you can kind of see it right here. You kind of almost have to do a blind because you really don't have that good of a view, but just make sure they're in there, and now we can put the valve cover back on. All right, got the valve cover on. Just make sure you go around the entire thing, checking the gasket to see if it's seated. If you made a mistake, now is the time to correct it. Double check the half moons back here, make sure they haven't fallen out of place. You kind of really just have to feel for it, and then triple check the spark plug cover gaskets. They could fall out while you're doing this. It'd be a really good idea if you could get someone to help you holding this side of the gasket while someone holds the other side. When you do it solo, there's a lot of real estate of the gasket that's exposed, so it kind of likes to sag or fall out of place. Lucky I was able to get it on, and it looks like it's situated pretty good. Just make sure this is centered, so we'll have to center the holes, and then we could start threading in the bolts and torquing it down slowly. All right, so I got the bolts started by hand, and when you're kind of threading by hand, you can kind of help guide the valve cover into its proper position. You can just make sure all these holes are lined up really nice and it's as centered as possible. I think I did a pretty good job here. When you torque the valve cover down, you're gonna have to do it in a pattern that pushes pressure down evenly, and I would recommend doing it in stages. Don't go all the way tight the first go around. So you might have to go 2 or 3 times around the valve cover to get it clamped down. So generally a crisscross pattern is recommended. If you don't know what I'm talking about, kind of look up what a inline 6-cylinder head bolt torque sequence is. So it's not for the valve cover, but the head bolts, you'll see that they're kind of opposing sides to clamp down evenly. I would recommend trying to do that. So what I'll probably end up doing is tightening down probably this here, there, this, that, and then go across until it clamps down evenly. And this is where a nut driver will come in handy. A torque wrench really isn't super accurate on a low torque spec like this. These bolts are torqued to 10 Newton meters. It is very easy to over torque it with a torque wrench and strip out the threads. But when you have a nut driver and you're doing it by hand, 10 Newton meters isn't that much. You could definitely do it by hand. You don't need a torque wrench. When you feel the bolt coming to a stop, don't go anymore. That's pretty much where it stops. That's all you really need to do. So I went in a crisscross pattern, trying to apply as evenly as possible, and I went in stages. I didn't just go all the way tight down the first time. I went a couple turns on each bolt and then went to the next one. So like I said, I kind of started from here, went to there, then this one, that one, and then crisscross all around. And literally just a couple turns every time. This probably took a good 10-15 minutes, just going super slow. And then now when I try to turn it now, it doesn't turn. So I'm not going super hard, obviously. As soon as I feel resistance, I stop. Whatever you could turn by hand, that's pretty close to 10 Newton meters. It's really not that much torque. So for sure, I think we have enough clamping force to prevent the gasket from leaking. As long as the gasket is situated properly, I think we're good to go. And now we can begin reassembling the engine. So first up, I'm going to put the wiring harness holder back together. So we just got to line up these slots right here, 1, 2, and 3, and then put a bolt there and a nut over here. Next up, I put the harness back for the coils. So they all have little grooves that they slide into. Just pay attention to that, and they kind of line up where they need to be. Next up, the ignition coils. So we're going to put them back in the reverse order that we removed them. All right, got the coils and spark plugs on. So just a reminder, when you do put this back together, the one in the back goes first, the one in the front goes second, and then the one in the middle goes last. So it goes on top. So just pay attention to that and make sure everything is routed correctly. All right, next up, while we still have some room to work in the back, I'm gonna put this little insulation piece back on. So we just gotta wiggle back into place, route the wire right here, and then just make sure everything goes back together the way it came. All right, next up, we got the ignition coil cover. We'll just put it back on. Just go really carefully, make sure not to scratch it. All right, once you got those Allen bolts torqued down, we can put the cover on for the wires. And we'll see, just mainly has clips that'll go into place. All right, next up, we're gonna reinstall the crossover tube so we can uncover our intake inlet. I guess we could just place our crossover tube back into its place. Once the crossover tube is installed, you got this clamp torqued down, you got these two 10mm bolts torqued down, and you got the mass airflow sensor back connected and clipped down. We can now put the engine cover back on, and then we just gotta put the little cover back on for the wiring on top of the valve cover. All right, so now we are done with replacing the valve cover gasket. Just make sure you clean up everything, double check, make sure everything's connected and torqued down. But now you can start your car, and I'd recommend starting it up, letting it warm up, take it for a drive, and change the oil. The reason why I say that is because we have the valve cover open, so who knows what got in there while we weren't looking. So it's just a good idea, cycle the oil, make sure it gets through the filter, and then change the oil, put a new filter in it, and you're good to go. Also, while you're driving your car, take a look, see if it's leaking anything, address it as quickly as possible. If you did everything right, you should be fine. There should be no leaks from the valve cover gasket. It should be good for the next few years. One thing I did not mention while I was doing this job was when you're taking this stuff apart, it is a good idea generally to go clean as much as you can. Every car will be different, so just when you're taking it apart, if you see something dirty, go ahead and clean it. I only really mentioned the mating surface for the valve cover gasket. There's definitely a lot more you could do that I did not mention, so just keep that in mind. I'll also post a link in the description to an article on a write-up about how to replace the valve cover gasket in case you need more help. I hope you found the video helpful. Thank you for watching.